My name is Mark Harwick. I'm the president of the Los Angeles Planning History Group, and thank you for joining us for this conversation with the author. Vinayak Bharne will be our speaker this evening. Our primary mission of the Los Angeles Planning History Group is to promote the active use of planning history to inform and guide LA's future. And we do this through various approaches, including colloquia and conversations with book authors. Our most recent colloquium was held on May 20th at the Huntington Library, entitled Los Angeles Olympics, 1932, 1984, and 2028, Lessons from the Past for the Future. So our board includes many folks in the planning field. That includes Marcia Rood, past president, Art Cueto, vice president, and Ken Farfsing, a treasurer. We also have Lillian Birkenheim-Silver. We also have Ken Bernstein, Aaron Chase, Todd Gish, Catherine Perez, Meredith Drake-Rutan, Alan Rifkin, Betsy Wiseman, Sergio Valdez, and most recently, Danny Wu. And Conversations with the Author is a series to highlight important research and research in the areas of planning and community development. We initiated this at the onset of COVID and haven't looked back. Authors participating in this series have included David Sloan, Ken Bernstein, Ken Farfsing, Barry Siegel, Liz Folletta, Josh Stevens, DJ Waldy, Bill Fulton, and let's see, that was our last speaker was Bill Fulton, and obviously our next speaker tonight is Vinayak. Our conversation this evening with Vinayak is for his book, Streets for All, 50 Ideas for Shaping Resilient Cities. Vinayak's previous books include, among others, Urbanism Beyond 2020 and Affordable Housing, Inclusive Cities. Principal and Director of Design at Muhl and Polizoides, Architects and Urbanists in Pasadena, and Adjunct Professor of Urbanism in the School of Architecture at USC, Vinayak is also on the Advisory Council of the Los Angeles Planning History Group. Moderating this evening's conversation will be Claire Bowin, Associate Principal at SALT Landscape Architects. After Vinayak's presentation, I encourage you to ask your questions verbally rather than typing them into the chat box. I will now turn it over to Claire, who will introduce our author and moderate the discussion following the presentation. Claire, please.
Great, thank you so much. And it's just a pleasure to be here. And I just couldn't be more thrilled to be introducing Vinayak. He and I actually go back to the beginning of the time I decided to migrate into this field. And so it's just been fun to be able to be here with him tonight. He is a practicing urban designer and city planner who's based in Los Angeles. His 25-year career has included practice, research, education, and activism. He is the principal and director of design at Muhl Polizoides, Architects and Urbanists, where some of his notable local projects have included Del Mar Station in Pasadena, the Boulevard in Lancaster, and numerous campus plans and specific plans for universities and municipalities throughout Southern California. In addition to all that, he's also an adjunct professor of urbanism in the USC School of Architecture. And I could go on and on, but I just am thrilled to introduce you to him this evening, and he's going to be talking about his book. Vinayak.
Where is he? Oh, there's Vinayak. Yeah.
Can you all see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces, senior mentors, and people who've been very precious to me, Mick, Marsha, etc., and then some friends, Meredith, Todd. So thank you all for coming. I know many of you know a lot more about Los Angeles than I do. So I'd first of all like to acknowledge Los Angeles Planning History Group for bringing this book into the fold. I'm well aware of the weight of the Los Angeles knowledge that your predecessors brought here. This is not a book about Los Angeles, so thank you for giving it a place, giving me a place, because I'm not a scholar of Los Angeles either. So it's great to be among all of you and well aware of that. The second thing I'd like to say is, this book marks kind of 25 years, I think, exactly of being in the field since I came as a graduate student to the US. And I think it's a good moment for me to acknowledge two of my teachers who I think set me on the path to what has led to this book. I think many of you know them. Tridi Banerjee was one of them. Tridi taught me rigorously about the socio-phenomenological aspects of cities, particularly in the global South. And then Stefanos Polizoides, who taught me about the morphological aspects of cities, particularly in the global North. And it was these sort of parallel pedagogies, almost contradictory in many ways, but equally rigorous, that set me on a path where you began to realize that at some point, it was never going to be about an either or, that although all of us claim to have numerous positions about what urbanism is and should be locally, globally, et cetera, there is no singular formula, charter, or manifesto that has all the answers. So the good news, having said that, is we thankfully now live in a time when we don't have to even talk about the fact that streets are not for cars. I mean, that's a stale argument. It's a waste of time to even discuss that. All of us in some form or the other are invested in reclaiming streets. So I don't want to get into simplistic discourses about why we should reclaim them, et cetera. The second reason that this is important is because there are tons of books on streets now. Beginning from 1960, when Bernard Rudofsky released Streets for People, that you see right there, to extraordinary books that were written by urban designers, documenting just meticulous streets, beautiful rooms, and begin to insinuate a discourse that began to really challenge the dogmas of high modernist ideologies, to really reclaim what streets meant from a sociological standpoint. But many of these books had the limitations of being written by designers, so they were really talking about lenses of urban transformation from their particular expertise. And then at the same time, largely in the academy, there was a whole series of books that came out over the last 20 years that in many ways, subtly or directly began to contradict these attitudes, which is began to say that they were skeptical about the overclaims that designers, particularly urban designers and architects, were making. And there was a lot of discourse that was generated in multiple ways over the last 3 decades on what streets have been, what streets can be, et cetera. So the good news is that we now have a context in which there is no shortage of discourse on streets from multiple perspectives, political, morphological, social, et cetera. And so the question that we asked 5 years ago when we began this book is, why and how do you now write a book on streets? How do you wedge yourself in here? There's such an incredible dialogue already underway. What more is there to do on this? And then it occurred to us that perhaps there were 2 things that might be done. One is, if you bring these people to a common platform and you begin to ask them to forge a sort of a dialogue about where things overlap, where things differ, and how there might be conciliatory positions about how things could tether together. So instead of taking either or positions that, that critique over claims or romanticize the informal aspect of a street or claim about great rooms and design being the only salvage for the future, are there connecting points that bring these things together? So the bottom line is, here's the meta thesis of the book. And this is why we decided to make it global, which is, the fact is that it's a really simple thing, but it is the heart of this book, essentially, that cities across the world are enormously different. And they're different not because of how they look, but because of the way they are governed. That is the fact that really is at the bottom, the root of this whole argument. And because they're different about how they're governed, the processes through which urban transformation happens, particularly something as simple as a street, is vastly different. The actors that shape it are different. The processes through which they are made are different. I mean, just to exemplify this, if you think about Los Angeles itself, the 80+ cities we have in LA are so different from each other. If you look at Pasadena, where I live, a multifamily project in Pasadena has to go through the City of Gardens ordinance. If I go to the city east of me, which is San Marino doesn't allow multifamily housing at all. So if you think about the jurisdictional landscape just of LA, it's like a series of wonderful kingdoms that have their own rules about how they want their future to be crafted. Now, if you take this discourse and turn it global, you realize that what we espouse as democratic planning, participatory planning, the virtues of it, et cetera, may be our way of thinking about it, but there are other worlds where these realities don't exist. And instead of putting a judgmental point that's saying, well, this is the way planning ought to be, well, there are enormous success stories, just enormous success stories that are happening in other parts of the world that simply do not have these kind of mechanisms in place. So how do you bring these success stories? How did the processes happen? What can we learn from them? So that was number one. So I'm only pointing out that there is an aspect of geographic pluralism, which needs to be brought into the picture firsthand, that although our overarching goals of making streets, reclaiming streets, making them incredible, inclusive, sustainable rooms for all of us, is a common thread that ties us together. The processes through which they will happen are different because we live in different cities. The second thing is that the agents that transform streets are so wonderfully different in their own place. So one of the things we have tried to do in this book, we're not, this is not an encyclopedia, we've tried, is to really bring a whole gamut of people who make cities. And so these are all the people we brought to, the essays by all these people that you see here, different kinds, talking about just looking at streets in different ways, analyzing streets through the different mediums, communicating street aspirations through different regimes, and eventually processes, engaging in processes that are themselves different, because the protagonists who are going to reap the benefits of all these transformations are different in the first place. So the book is plural, the book is murky, the book is sort of blurry in its lines. And what I'll do is just take you through some of the key, a sampling of some of the key ideas, just a teaser, and then we can have a discussion. So to keep it super simple and readable, we did a couple of important things. We insisted that the essay is not to exceed 2,500 to 3,000 words, because it's easily readable stuff, that they be erudite, but not academic. We used kind of the National Geographic model, just essays that are well-written, but not just so steeped in theoretical discourse that it becomes hard for a person to read it. So our aim for the audience of this book was certainly not architects and urban designers and academics alone. It was everybody. And so a simple structure, 5 sections, and I'll go through each of them. And in between the sections are intermezzos, which I will talk about as well. So the first one is the most obvious one, the receptacle for public life. The streets have always been around for public life, but these authors really talk about some very nuanced aspects. And the first of them that I've picked out is a very distinguished UCLA professor, Anastasia Sideris. Many of you know her. She's the book on downtown Los Angeles with Tridib Banerjee was hers. I think it's called Urban Design Downtown. And the main point she makes here is, since public health officials have now for a long time espoused, and Jane Jacobs did certainly, talking about the importance of sidewalks, she makes very interesting arguments through, of course, her book, Sidewalks, which is the difference between the idea of creating sidewalks, particularly because you're not in cars, you're not enclosed in cars, doesn't give you the ability of thinking of sidewalks as just conduits from place to place. They're places where you essentially linger in so many different ways. And so her essay really touches upon the fact that although there's a lot of investment going into so-called improving sidewalks as the great salvage for making streets better, it has such intricate nuances with the sociology of the place that simply investing in sidewalks has often failed in creating conduits that go from place to place. And she exemplifies this both through case studies in Los Angeles and beyond. So the whole point here is something we all talk about, I think, to establish more nuanced relationships with the land uses, the cultural identities of a place, and the sidewalks and the type of sidewalks that you create. At the same time, on the other extreme, there are incredible projects that are now, particularly in metropolitan areas, creating vast pedestrian-friendly zones, almost linear plazas, exclusively pedestrian, particularly in metropolitan regions where public space in certain areas is becoming very difficult. So this is a case study of the Wharf project in DC by Perkins Eastman, a very large architecture engineering firm. It's an ambitious project because it essentially takes the southwestern waterfront of DC and pedestrianizes it. It's a 60-foot right-of-way and creates a number of zones. It's a very detailed case study that goes into all the elements that go along this entire length and how you negotiate different activities along it and the success stories that has sparked over the last few years since its implementation. But when you go to the other extreme, you have other aspects of public life and public space. And this reminds us that at the end of the day, how we use public space in different cities itself is different. If I'm not mistaken, I think Mumbai, I could be wrong in my stats, has less than 5 square meters per person in public space. I think it's enormously paltry. It's around 1.1 or something like that, compared to London, which is close to around 30, and New York, which is around 25. So population density makes an enormous difference in how we think of public spaces, etc. So this is simply to share that in a place like Mumbai, which is one of the densest cities on the planet, there is an incredible negotiation of street life, which happens on a spontaneous basis. So these are two sections that the author shows, where the same street in the day that's a conduit for cars now is negotiated in ways that are incredibly uncanny. So the right-of-way has angled parking, which squeezes the travel lanes to barely something you can go through. It's all taken over by vendors during a large part of the day. When the peak hour of the train station arrives again, the angled parking goes away, and taxis come and park to receive the passengers that are coming from the train stations. When that all goes away at night, the pavement dwellers who are unhoused in the city of Mumbai, almost 50% of the city, come and use the sidewalks to go to sleep. And then the next morning again, the section becomes a conduit for cars and repeats itself. Now, obviously, this is an incredible, uncanny almost from our point of view, pulsation in terms of spontaneous management of a city. I mean, how do you manage, how do you regulate this aspect? So she gets into the complexities that cities like Mumbai face to, on the one hand, accommodate this kind of public life, and on the other hand, to what degree you can actually even think of regulating it. My own essay here gets into a subject which I have written about and studied for almost 2 decades, which is the ubiquitous presence of wayside shrines. This is simply to remind you that in the global places in the global south, there is an aspect of urbanism that is often undermined, which is religion and religious influences on the city. The weight that religious insignia and signatures carry in the public realm is incredible. And they are enormous. They have enormous resilience. These are studies I've done on just simple anonymous wayside shrines in India that occur under trees, but they're so powerful in terms of their communal patronage that even if they are demolished, as they were in certain metropolitan areas in India, they return back. So it's almost like, I always tell my students, it's like a pimple on my face. It doesn't tell me when I'm going to arrive, and I either have the choice of covering it up or embracing it as part of my reality. So the point is, religion plays a crucial role in the destiny of certain cities, and we often, as top-down planners, do not know how to grapple with these aspects. The second section gets into the aspect of socioeconomic catalysts. So how can streets really bring greater economic inclusiveness? How can it generate fiscal prosperity in quite the literal sense of the word? And here we begin with a discussion with a Tufts University professor who's edited this incredible book and also written other books largely on the theme of just urbanism, stemming, of course, from the idea of justice. Julian Arguman, many of you might know the name. And his most famous book is an edited book called Incomplete Streets, which is a kind of critique on, obviously, the notion of complete streets, which is now, an evolving concept. So the original idea, as many of us know, was insinuated by bike advocates. And then the term, of course, has evolved now and into encompassing a lot of many things we go through. But this is a crucial point that many academics continue to make and many theorists continue to make, mainly sociologists, which is to what degree do actual complete streets with all the beautiful sidewalks and all the multimodality, to what degree do they exacerbate the existing social divides on streets, and to what degree do they actually mitigate them? And the only point that Julian is making here is this is important for urban designers, particularly that no one is denying the importance of great design. Great design is crucial. It is one of the best tools to generate inclusiveness. But perhaps most urban designers, and I can speak as a practitioner, we do not get the opportunity of actually monitoring, or even for that matter, delving into data that actually tells us the legacy that our designs have spawned. We don't really get into 10 years down the line into understanding, have people been displaced? What did my street design really do? And this is a plea or a pitch to really, connect the two sides of the field and equalize them. The second essay in this section goes to Cairo and talks about an incredible project that was done in 2021 when this book was released. We were lucky enough to find these people just a year before we released the book. This is a nonprofit. It's actually an organization, a for-profit organization called U for Urban Impact that was started by two young women in Cairo. And what they did during the peak of the economic downturn in 2020 was they created in downtown Cairo a large event in the main street of downtown Cairo, only to bring people out because the street was desolated, the downtown was desolated. So the whole idea of using event-based planning as tools to actually bring people out of their homes and generate a kind of an awareness about what Cairo meant, how Cairo's streets could be reclaimed from an economic standpoint. That's what this study is about. So the whole idea of reenacting theatrical events in streets and choreographing them, particularly in critical times, crisis times. When we go to cities in the global South, no discussion on that side of the world can happen without the informal sector. And this is a very insightful essay that talks about very directly how public realm projects in situ negotiation of spaces between informal habitats, that the informal homes that are there in these slums can actually become enormous conduits for transforming them. So this is a case study of a couple of projects written by this author that really talk about first analyzing slums and informal settlements through oral histories, through interviews, through processes that are quite different from the morphological ones we do here, and then inserting yourself through nonprofits and other mediums to really talk about the in-between spaces as the first conduits before we get into the homes. This is a very insightful essay by a very well-known Indian scholar who has devoted a lot of her study to the aspect of streets and children. It's a subject we don't really talk about, but it's a fascinating insight that really argues that children have a very different way of understanding streets, and how might we really bring them into both creating streets and insinuating processes where they can themselves create the kind of spaces that they might want. So that's the case study about, specifically focused on the idea of vital public spaces for children. And then finally, a project that I myself have been part of at Mullen Policy's. This is Lancaster Boulevard. Many of you know it. In 2010, during the economic downturn, the city had identified the historic Main Street, which was ravaged by sprawl. It was a 100-foot right of way, and they invested $14 million at that time. And within 8 months, after we finished the design, within 8 months, the city officials hired a crew and they constructed the street. Now, there were the story goes behind the scenes into talking about with the city manager, et cetera, and how the outreach and everything helped. But the key point, when one of the reasons this project got some recognition is because 3 years after we finished this project in 2011, it brought back $300 million of economic development investment. So investing $14 million, bringing back $300 million, an enormous success story. This project won a national award for planning, primarily because it had really changed the economic index of the city. The other thing this aspect talks about is this is not about designers or administrators, the importance of being collaborative. This is classic top-down planning, which is a great privilege we have in the United States, but it is collaborative top-down planning. So we all have a role to play. I mean, the city officials envisioned this idea. They're the visionaries. The consultants came and played their role. The consultants finished their work. The city took it over again, hired a crew, negotiated all the funding, constructed the street. So a collaborative effort that goes on, and that's what the privilege of top-down planning is about. Now, when landscape architects, who are, in my opinion, at least at the cutting edge of urban design today, I've always said that, and I will continue to say that, I think landscape is a discipline that is truly at the cutting edge of urbanism, in my opinion. and it's really talking about some of the most urgent aspects that we need to address. This really gets into the idea of the street as part of a multi-species urbanism. And there is now enormous discourse that talks about thinking of our cities, not just for humans, but for the many other denizens with whom we share our cities. So we did an interview with two very well-known figures in the field of landscape, Kelly Shannon, who used to be here at USC and is now back in Belgium, and Bruno de Mulder, very well-known figures who have written a lot about this subject. And this is a scholarship essay that really takes you back into great urban history to make the point that great places in the past always had an enormous ecological dimension to them, not a beautification dimension. Landscape was a given, but the ecological aspects about edibility, about bringing in, nurturing the other denizens of our cities, birds, bees, pollinators, is not something new. This was always done in the greatest cities in the world. We've just forgotten that this existed. Bolder Approaches to Street Design, a wonderful essay about Los Angeles that talks about a fascinating subject that on the one hand, we do talk a lot about ecological aspects of our streets on a very large scale. But the challenge is if you want to ecologize our streets, talk about reducing heat islands, water collection, all the things, impervious, pervious paving, all the things we love to do, planting more trees. The challenge is in a city like Los Angeles, which is so vast, and we have so many streets to tackle, how are you going to get it done? So this really calls for a process that is, do we need a different approach to adopting what we're going to attack? That's the question this essay asks. And what it really does is it says, if you think, for example, of something like Vermont Avenue, which is such a long street that connects so many different areas, so many different neighborhoods, districts, could we just take Vermont as an idea, as an ecological corridor, as a linear forest, and really create ecological conditions along the entire length of Vermont, which could then become a seam that helps so many neighborhoods along the way, rather than scattering our approaches to different streets. So it's calling you for an alternative way of thinking of how you invest money, how you invest ideas, and rather than doing it in various different places, perhaps concentrating it along major corridors and really bringing them alive. Fewer of them, but along important lengths might be a more intelligent way of thinking. We go to Australia, which, as many of you might know, have done enormous work in terms of augmenting the green infrastructure of places like Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, these cities are really at the cutting edge of what landscape can do in cities. But this essay by a landscape architect, a very well-known landscape architect in Melbourne, talks about the challenge of the theoretical aspiration of planting trees and the virtues of planting trees in streets, which goes without saying, but the actual challenge of implementing it, which is that trees have their own life until they reach their prime. So you may plant 1,000 trees, but until they grow to their maximum height and give you the foliage and give you the oxygen levels that you're seeking and talking about net zero carbon achievement, it's going to take a long time. So he points out the challenges of selecting tree species, negotiating which trees are planted where, how fast they grow, and gets into the whole subject of landscape that is much more nuanced than thinking of pure form. We often think of trees as form and of course other virtues, but we don't think of them as organisms that have their own life in terms of how they grow. And related to this is, of course, the whole idea of streets as eco-corridors. And Netherlands is actually, along with Canada, so two of these countries have really done some of the most cutting-edge work when it comes to this. So here's what is happening in Los Angeles now, thankfully. But this is an essay about ecoducts, and really takes you to the Dutch countryside, where they've incorporated and implemented some of the greatest ecoducts. And this is an essay that talks about how, although there are so many efforts that have taken highways and buried them under ecoducts through studies of the migratory patterns of birds and beasts and how they really travel, the key point that this essay makes is that it is only by monitoring these creatures that we understand that even if you do these kind of projects, it takes an enormous amount of time for these creatures to change their behavior and use these man-made streets and landscapes. So it's not like saying we're going to do these things and life is going to be better than before. It takes an enormous amount of time for them to understand how to negotiate and navigate these crossings that you created. There's another wonderful case study in this essay called the Bee Highway, which is another Dutch project that takes 10 miles of a massive highway and plants flowers that will attract bees. I mean, they're just wonderful implemented projects that have been done, and that's what they're about. And finally, the last two chapters, here we get into real urban design in the conventional sense, the mainstream sense, the street as urban form. And we go to Barcelona, where I'm sure many of you know this project. There's an essay that really talks about the super block plan. And Barcelona, as you know, was a pretty relentless grid that was won by Cerdà as a competition in extending the Ensanche, the historic city that you see right there. And over time, as urbanization in Barcelona matured, more cars came in, and today Barcelona, not today, but a few years ago, is a very congested city. So this is a super block plan that really takes in 9 to 12 block clusters. And in those 9 to 12 block clusters, takes all the streets between those Cerdà blocks, which are about 220 by 220 feet, and allows only select vehicles like the residential vehicles or emergency vehicles. It does not allow anything else. It's all pedestrian. And then these large green streets outside these 9 to 12 block clusters are the streets whose sections are changed and they become the travel routes through the city. And this is an ongoing project that is portions of it have been implemented, but it just reminds you how cities evolve over time and tackle issues that are completely unanticipated over their evolution. Bridges, we don't think of these as streets. There's one of my favorite essays in the book. It really reminds us that some of the most interesting street designs are actually bridges. They connect one side of the street to the other. They connect one street to the other. And although at their worst, they are utilitarian constructs that are supposedly telling us to cross obstructions to the ground, including some of our rivers, they are some of the most iconic buildings that we could think about. And the essay really gets into how the design of bridges may actually inform the design of our streets. And then I take you to Japan, a place I have lived in, studied. I have a book on it as well. I've been fascinated with Japanese streets for the simple reason that streets in Japan today, such as the ones you see at the bottom right, have identities that are found in no other part of the world. And this is because they stem from realities that are exclusively and only Japanese. For instance, Tokyo is a place which is 80% mountainous. The amount of buildable land in Tokyo is extremely scarce. The idea of having large parks and open spaces is simply not possible. And over time, wonderful rules have laxed many things for obvious reasons. The other thing, I don't know if you know, is Japan is a country, a small country, enormously dense country. Tokyo is around 32 million people now, living in one of the densest cities in the world. And you have anywhere from 100 to 150 tremors and earthquakes that are destroying these cities from time to time. If you look at Tokyo's evolution, it has been destroyed again and again and again, unlike any other city, not through any war or bombing, but simply through earthquakes and tremors. So the rules that insinuate new construction are often laxed. And as a result, amazing transformations have happened. Tokyo is the most transit-oriented city in the planet. The amount of stations and train lines compared to the area of Tokyo is much greater than any other city on the planet. And at the transit nodes, you have buildings where streets have public life beneath them, but the defining elements of the streets are buildings where land uses are stacked on each other in random ways. So you could have a pachinko parlor at the bottom, you could have a residential use on the top, you could have a hotel on the third floor, you could have a spa on the fourth. And because the rules are lax, you're allowed to change your signage the way you want. And the result is these Zakyo buildings, which are unlike anything else the world sees. This is an essay by a leading transportation consultant, Peter Swift from Colorado, who has done a lot of studies on how medieval European streets, the sort of wonderful crank geometries that we often love in urban design, can negotiate some of the problems we face in streets today. So this is an essay where he uses the studies of Camille Cité, but essentially talks about the challenges of, on the one hand, wanting to bring these fractile geometries into urban design, and then negotiating aspects like fire trucks, fire departments, turning radii, and all the things that shape our cities to such a degree today that we cannot escape. And the last section gets into the idea of the future of the street. What is the street as an innovative piece of infrastructure? What guises will streets see in the future? John Young, he's the president of the Intelligence Community Forum in Canada. It's a wonderful organization, if you guys don't know this. He's one of the leading authorities today on technology and urbanism. And he talks here about how already across the world, from New York to Malta to Sweden, numerous digital technologies are beginning to change the way the performative aspect of streets is beginning to show new ways of what streets can be. And then finally, we get into just very on-the-ground aspects. This is products that are coming into the market about what street pavements and street life could be. This is one where pavers of a particular kind collect rainwater and harvest the rainwater, but show the rainwater to pedestrians as you're walking past them, rather than just sort of allow it to steep into the ground. So it becomes like an awareness project where you're seeing the rainwater, and then the rainwater goes down, and talks about how aspects like this can be used, particularly in areas with great rain, as a remedy for floodscapes. In Netherlands, there's an enormous project underway in Amsterdam, where although Amsterdam doesn't have the kind of congestion we talk about in the United States, they're still trying to decongest the city by removing on-street parking, by creating parked garages beneath some of their canals. I mean, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it's a very interesting project. So what they've done is they've built the first garage under one of the canals, as you see right here, and there are others underway. But the idea is, by removing parked cars on the street in all the neighborhoods surrounding the canals, you're now creating more public space for people, which will bring greater quality of life. So it's a great investment in high-tech infrastructure, which is going to reap benefits. And what the legacy is of this is still up for grabs, because it's a brand new project. It'll probably take another 5, 6, or 10 years for us to understand what exactly it means. And then the last essay ends with a crucial subject today. In a time when more than 70% of the waste that we produce in the world ends up in landfills and open dumps. And this essay takes you to projects in New York, Sweden. I think there is one in Switzerland, which really talk about how the issue of waste is now being rethought under the street in cutting-edge ways in some of the most affluent countries in the world. Between these 5 sections, just to keep the discussion more lighter, we brought in 5 intermezzos, just where you don't have to read too much, but just enjoy what a street can be. The first of these is a wonderful series of sketches by one of Hong Kong's leading urban designers, Peter Cookson-Smith. He's the founder of Urbis. I'm sure many of you heard the name of that firm. And he's a wonderful genius when it comes to sketching what street life can be. And he's done many books on just sketches of daily life in Hong Kong. And you can read what he's trying to say about it, and this sort of contrast with the European way of understanding streets. The second intermezzo takes you into streets in India, which are unique because the urbanism of India over the last, many years has been shaped by just epochs, one after the other. So you have, the sort of indigenous histories of India, of the monarchs and the great kings, and then the colonial layer that comes in and brings in, other ways of thinking about urbanization. the sort of post-colonial ideas of modernism being embraced, the neoliberal India post-1990, et cetera, et cetera. So this really gets into a evolutionary overview of what morphologies, or what the forces are that have changed morphologies of Indian cities. Bruce Ekberg, who wrote the essay on Australia, does another beautiful gallery of just trees all over the world, and how it's just the idea of street trees, what they can do, what their promise is, all the way from ecological aspects to just simple form giving in terms of urban design. And then finally, we went and lucky enough to get well-known British painter Oliver Bevan, who's done enormous work on just documenting through paintings the life of streets. And he often says that, we spoke to him and he often says, you know, when I draw, I'm partly painting and partly dreaming, because every painting is talks about what is there, but also talks about what I want it to be. And then the last one is also a very well-known Dutch photographer, Bas Loskut, who has this wonderful book. If you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to. It's called Out of Place. And it's a series of photographs that really take you through an aspect that is, you know, an obvious one, but we don't think about it. In the age we live in, I could be sitting in a public street, or I could be sitting in a public plaza, but I could be on my laptop doing a Zoom meeting with my friend in another part of the world, and I could be entirely private in a public space. Or on the other hand, you know, I could be speaking from my bedroom at a national event. I could be public in someone's eyes, but I could be sitting in the privacy of my house. And so this nuanced subject is captured through beautiful street life photographs, where he particularly captures the expressions of pedestrians who are public, so to say, but they are lost in their world. And it is these incredible expressions of their own private lives that he's trying to highlight. So I'll leave you with these thoughts and then turn it over to Claire. You know, this book is essentially about humility, I think. And the reason I call it this way is because it is easier for all of us to think that we know. But I think when you bring different intelligent minds to the table, I think it brings the point to the forefront how much we don't know, how much there is to know. So this is a book that really, I think, calls us all to simply expand our spheres of curiosity. We respect each other's incredible positions of what urbanism and streets can be. But at the end of the day, I think we all know that we only know a bit of the answer. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to you, Claire.
Great. Thank you so much for that. That was really, really amazing. I know I've got a few questions, and I imagine that members of our audience do as well. But I thought I would just take a few minutes before we get into the kind of Q&A, just to kind of frame a little bit about kind of what is going on, you know, in Los Angeles, and why this book really resonates for me. And I imagine hopefully it resonates for many of you, and hopefully you'll get a chance to purchase it and learn more about really the breadth and wealth and depth of information that's here, because I feel like we can learn so much about it here in Los Angeles. You know, I'm going to talk about LA. It's kind of, you know, the whole kind of southern region. Obviously, I'm more familiar with the city of Los Angeles, but, you know, just this area, we have such a diversity of street types. And I know it's very hard to kind of get your arms around what is the city of Los Angeles, or what is the area. There's no kind of one way to define LA, right? There are so many different neighborhoods. There are so many different kind of peoples and cultures and economies. And our streets really reflect that diversity. I mean, maybe the most common thread, obviously running probably through all of our streets, unfortunately, is that we have for the last 100 years, certainly in Los Angeles, kind of dedicated a lot of that space to the car. And that's why I get so excited about this book, because I think, as many of you probably agree who are here, you know, joining us tonight, is that the streets, as Vinayak has so aptly pointed out, really offer us so much more potential, and how much more amazing our city could be if we really start to look at and kind of unearth that richer potential, our streets as places for play, and chatting and gathering and vending. And there is, a whole culture here of people who walk, many miles and, take transit and use the space. But I think that there's an opportunity here, with this book to delve further into that and see how we can continue to kind of learn from what he's shared with us, not only about the different types of ideas that people have tried in other places of the world, but the processes that they have used to bring those into reality, because that is oftentimes, again, the challenge here in a city that is so complex and so large. I mean, fortunately, though, we have been, I think, setting the table here in Los Angeles for a number of years. I think the time is right for this book. We're really ready, I think, to listen and to embrace this. I think many people, here maybe get frustrated by the fact that things like the mobility plan, 2035 that was adopted a number of years ago, there hasn't been on some level a lot of progress. But I would argue, though, that there are a lot of things that have been kind of slowly happening. The city has done there are the People Streets program, and there's parklets. We've got Ciclavia happening. And I think all of this has just helped to kind of elevate in people's minds the value and the joy people find by having streets that where they get to occupy the space and not just, in a car. I was at a conference earlier today with about 30 different people from the city of Los Angeles and from the county Park and Recs department and MWD, talking about native plants and how we can scale up the use of native plants, in not only parks and places like that are, owned by municipalities, but also the streets. And it was brought up that even the recent next iteration of the active transportation grant is going to now score you based on kind of incorporating, plants and native plants. So I think there's growing and ongoing interest in, again, seeing these streets as places to occupy, but also understanding the role. And Vinayak has pointed that out, a number of places in the book where other places, and as well as here, I've been looking at how we can use these spaces not only, as corridors for habitat corridors to connect species as well as connect people. So that's kind of where I said I'm super excited. I want to start trying all these different things and figure out how we can do some more of this. So I'm gonna stop with that kind of a bit of a background, and I thought I would just ask Vinayak a couple of questions, and then again, I'm sure many of you here tonight or joining us also have some questions. So my first one for Vinayak is, you have authored and edited books on urbanism. How did your role as an editor and not an author enhance or influence the making of this book?
Well, I think you could never write a book like this. I think no singular individual could write a book on streets like this. I mean, what this book tries to do is, there are numerous books, as I pointed out, that people have written, but eventually we are all, people with limited biases and limited experiences. So while there is enormous value in the depth that an individual brings to a book that he authors, there is enormous limitation in authored books as well. And the great privilege of having edited books is that you can actually forge a contestation between these dialogues. So this is a book that essentially sets that contestation, like others have done. I mean, it's not the first edited book on streets at all. And so the joy of being an editor was literally to curate. And there were a number of important responsibilities. One, who do you bring? So we had to really, it was a 5-year project. We had to seek the authors. We had to seek wonderful people who had written so much about so many things and convince them to come and write for this effort. I don't have to tell you, many of these people are extremely well-known figures in their field, and many times if they know that there are other positions that this book is also going to espouse, they're not necessarily comfortable about it. So you have to convince them that this is a book that will bring it all together. So that's number one. And the second aspect about being an editor is that you get to curate the structure of the book. I mean, we could have done this book in a completely different way. We could have done this book, purely on disciplines in the street as what a transportation engineer would do, what an urban designer would do. But we felt that because this book tries to keep the subject murky and really collide these discussions into each other, it was not possible to draw lines between disciplines, that each case study was so multidisciplinary that you had all these people inadvertently doing so many things that were crossing lines into other fields, that the only way to structure a book like this was to keep broad sections where it brought them together. And so, I will confess that it's very difficult for me as I read this book today, as I read some of the essays, to say, oh my God, they might have been better in another section. But that's the joy of being an editor, that you take a stance and you realize that some of the ideas proposed in one section are lurking behind the other.
Lovely. So I'm going to ask one more question. I'll save my third one to kind of as a wrap up, as I'll let others speak. But as a practitioner, do you see this book as an advocacy for more expansive and immersive attitudes to practice?
Well, of course, it goes without saying. I mean, I've been in practice for 25 years exactly. But mainstream practice is an extremely limited way of transforming cities. I mean, any practitioner will tell you that we are at the mercy of our clients. I mean, that's just the simple fact. You get your victories and successes, but at the end of the day, I mean, the last chapter of my Urbanism Beyond 2020 book is called The Pawn and the Chess Game. And the reason I use that term is because I've always felt that as urban designers and architects, we are pawns in the larger chess game of city making. We do not make the most important decisions. There are 20 players on the chessboard that are making 10,000 more decisions, much more. I'm brought into a street project after the station has already been located, and I'm frustrated because it was in the wrong place, but there's nothing I can do about it. So I think mainstream practice, when you're talking about clients and municipal processes and entitlement processes and all that, is a daunting task to take on. I think it's not an easy thing to do, but it has its successes and limitations. All I'm trying to say here is it is the recognition of these limitations that made me realize that there are other ways of practicing. So the reason, for example, like Todd and Meredith and many others, some of us stepped into the academy, I'm sure, is because it's also a way of practicing. I think we insinuate projects through our students. We explore and even identify projects that we would never get to do in our practice world. We become part of organizations like this because we forge dialogues that become advocacy pieces. I think practice is a plural word. And I like to think that all of us sitting here in some form or the other are accomplished practitioners that have things to teach each other.
Great. I want to take a pause from asking questions and see if there's any questions from our audience that they'd like to ask Vinayak. Don't be shy.
I'd like to start off. Vinayak, thank you very much. I mean, what a great overview of a really terrific book. It seems to me that certainly we're thinking about streets as places for living. And probably before the automobile, they were used for living a lot more than they are now. We're trying to get back to something like that, I think. And so I was wondering about your thoughts on the whole notion of Vision Zero and some other things that are trying to at least slow down the movement of automobiles on streets, which I think ostensibly is to help make them safer for pedestrians and bicyclists and that sort of stuff. Is that something that's just sort of a United States kind of a venture, or is that something that's sort of seen around the world?
Well, I think all of these ideas that revolve around this basic notion, I think were born in the cradle of the affluent West. I think that has to be acknowledged. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. I think it's also important that a lot of people sort of don't usually, at least I've come to this conclusion that if you think of the sort of the larger majority world, the kind of processes, mainstream processes that are shaping cities in the global South are largely imports from the West. I'm talking of mainstream. I'm talking of things like zoning, Euclidean planning, driving patterns, etc. The aspirations behind driving patterns. The specific realities, Mark, are entirely different. So, for instance, if you take simply patterns of driving, in India, there is no lane driving at all. Now, legally, you are supposed to drive in the lane, but it never happens, right? So this is where I'm trying to go. So I think and that's what sparked the discussions in this book, which is the aspirations are similar. So I think the idea of not making streets for cars, the idea of bringing pedestrians, all that is a noble aspiration. But culturally, they couldn't be more dissimilar. For instance, I remember, I think it was Michael Sorkin, the late great Michael Sorkin, who went to India some time back, came back and said, I saw the most democratic street in the world. And he said it because he said, in India, I could say that for 10 other places in other parts of the world, but he said, you have pedestrians, vehicles, dogs, cows, bicycles, monkeys. I mean, they're all elephants if you go to certain parts, camels. They're all using and finding their place on the street. What could be more democratic? And he wrote about it. I mean, that's a sort of witty insinuation, but the point he's making is that streets are, those parts of the world probably crave the kind of regulation we have here, even as our parts of the world crave, to some degree, I think, the spontaneous informality that goes in there. And I think this is the dichotomy that we're trying to reconcile in this book, which is just recognize that none of us has got it right. There's just a lot to learn from either side.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I'll jump in with another question, or Mark, you've got one? Yeah, Alex?
Yeah, Vinayak, the scope of the book is so exciting to take this one aspect, one piece of our environment, and to look at it everywhere. I am wondering, seeing all that comes out in the observations and the analysis of the book, does anything strike you as great ideas from other places that might do well here?
Well, I think that is a question that so many of you should answer much better than me. I think the specifics is not important. I think, as Claire alluded to earlier, particularly in Los Angeles, what has been enormously encouraging, at least in my 25 years here, is to see just how much transformation has happened in this place. I mean, I remember reading about, You Have to Pay for the Public Life almost 30 years ago when I was an undergrad in India. And, could believe the fact that an architect would chuckle and write a paper just lamenting the fact that people stood in line outside Disneyland and paid whatever it was, $25 or whatever it was at that time to get into Main Street Disneyland because there was no public space in the rest of the city. And then I came to LA and the first book I read was Rena Banham's book. And then he had written in 1972. And then I came across The City Discovered, I think, or whatever it was, by Charles Moore. And that was written in 1983. And the funny part was when Banham wrote it in 1972, he wrote a chapter called A Note on Downtown, because that is all it deserves. And in 1983, when Charles Moore wrote it, he actually made the first chapter downtown. And he said, downtown is the historic heart and really needs to be brought back. And so as I looked at downtown now and just, all the downtowns that are going on in LA, I just want to say, Alex, first of all, we should not be undermining. There's a lot of things we could learn from elsewhere, but to Claire's point, I don't think we should be undermining the enormous efforts that LA has done. I was talking to Marsha about Old Pasadena's transformation. These are outstanding projects that are enormously complicated, that have been born out of the realities of this place. This is what I'm trying to say. It's like we cannot undermine them and say, oh, we missed the ball, so we need to go. Now, at the same time, you look at James Ross's studies on East Los Angeles, and they bring a whole other discourse into the picture. That is, I think, what's so beautiful about LA, that it is a city that, has place for so many different dialogues, so many different ways of thinking. So I want to answer your question specifically, but all I will say is that I think this book, in a way, alludes to two things. On the one hand, in the context of LA, to acknowledge all the top-down efforts that have gone on to sort of reclaim again, the 1,000 miles of train tracks that it once had, and we're bringing them back and doing all the things we have to. And on the other hand, I think there is enormous discourse in Los Angeles now about looking at Los Angeles as the great, informal economy, the sort of the place of the vendors and all the projects that are going on. So in many ways, as funny as it may seem, it kind of, with a tongue in the cheek, I would say it's kind of nice that a person living in Los Angeles edited this book, because I think there are many cities in the world, few cities in the world, that would give you the kind of issues to grapple with, the all-encompassing issues to grapple with as Los Angeles does, many of which are captured in this book.
Mark, I think you had did you want to ask another question?
Just one other thing. I think it's, I like when you closed, you mentioned expand our sphere of curiosity. And so that just made me think back, once COVID hit and we were all kind of hanging around at home for everybody, it wasn't too long before people were starting to try the streets. And I remember seeing all kinds of streets that were getting closed off, and, people were making different use of their streets, playing in them, hanging out, all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering if that is something that has stuck, or it just was just a momentary thing. And maybe, again, that's because of our culture. It may or may not stick. But I thought that was a really neat kind of phenomenon that occurred.
I think I did write about this in my Urbanism Beyond 2020. The pandemic literally inverted the notion of the street, because during the peak of the pandemic, the most precarious thing in our minds was that we didn't want to be in enclosed spaces. And the moment we learned that the COVID virus was being spread through droplets and aerosols, all of us wanted to be outdoors. That was just fact, which meant that an enclosed grocery store, or even an enclosed hospital, had a greater chance of giving you the virus than a street. So when the restaurants closed their doors, all these wonderful things began to happen, the parklets, and we all know that, and that was fantastic. But there were a lot of other innovations that were happening. For example, in places like Mumbai, in places like Bogota, and places many others, which are much denser than what we were having here, the difficulty that people were having is not making places like this, but actually figuring out whether people would adhere to rules that were needed during COVID. So in other parts of the world, what I'm trying to get at is, we often take this privilege for granted here that, okay, we'll lay out all these things, we'll put the parklets, we'll remove cars, we'll do everything. But it works because you have a culture that's used to a kind of a regulated way of life. But for example, in places in Africa and places in South Asia, the biggest difficulty was having people lining up or keeping 6 feet apart, et cetera, et cetera. So where I'm going with this is there were numerous instances, and we document some of these in the book, where there were a lot of wonderful initiatives that were created in other parts of the world in streets. Simple painting was done to keep people 6 feet apart, et cetera, et cetera. The difficulty was, while all these projects were real, innovative, and wonderful, it was far more difficult to keep the performance of these projects from a usability standpoint real and controlled, because you can only control so much about human behavior.
Vinayak, you talked about the project out in Lancaster and being, top down, but it's still very, very successful in the collaborative process. And you noted that, a number of the kind of efforts that we have made here, in Los Angeles are for the most part been also kind of top down. And I have to, I'm kind of curious maybe for you to think about what were some of the maybe more successful bottom up processes you learned, or things that inspired you that maybe we could take some lessons from, and maybe trying to find grassroots groups here and encourage grassroots groups here to do something, in the streets.
Well, I think, Claire, it's already happening. I mean, I think there's a lot going on already. I mean, I was reading about a project in the Watts district where, edible landscapes have been created now in the green strips along the sidewalks. I mean, so grassroots efforts are not new to our region. I think what's happens in the art district, a lot of things that are happening already down in the arts district are enormous grassroots effort. I've been a huge, sort of a voyeur of the garment district. I just go there from time to time, or Broadway on Chinatown, just to sort of see how people claim their spaces by themselves. So all I'm saying is, it's all here right in front of us. LA has always had it. I think the difficulty for us, as opposed to some of these other parts of the world where this is a way of life, is because we are used to a regulated planning being the sort of dominant rubric of what urban planning and city making means, we often do not know, I think, as franchise professional planners, how effectively we will engage with these phenomena. That's all it is. Whereas in the other parts of the world, it's not that it matters or it doesn't matter. It doesn't exist because planning doesn't even come close to touching these phenomena, like the wayside shrines that I mentioned, which are happening at a force and at a pace and in numbers that are overwhelming the city anyway. Whereas we don't find that phenomenon here. And that, to me, is the biggest difference. Because we are used to a planning landscape that is so regulated, we often find the fracture in trying to sort of extend the arm and trying to figure out how do we engage with this informality. That's the other part of the world, to me, doesn't have that kind of problem because informality dominates the city in the first place. But in LA, I would say it's all around us. We probably need to make a greater effort in bringing it into planning discourses.
Well, that's a good segue to my next question is, like, as a resident of Los Angeles, what do you see as the most significant promise of rethinking street urbanism?
Well, I would say the biggest issue in LA right now is affordability. And I think in my book, at least, there is no greater aspiration that anything we do with streets should have than talking about how to mitigate the affordability crisis. And I've always felt that in a place like LA, a place like the United States, particularly in Southern California, where top-down planning has shown so much enormous transformation over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, what is happening in LA is truly amazing and consequential in the planning side. I continue to maintain that. I think the greatest gift our city has is our corridors. We are a city of corridors. We are a city of hundreds of corridors. I may be exaggerating, but probably not. And none of them are ready for anything. And I think to the degree, and we are unnecessarily beginning to talk about densification in ways that are, I think, less visionary than they can be. I think our corridors, which are streets, if prepared in so many amazing ways that we know how to, can really become the places that can bring in more housing, bring in more diversity. And if each city really takes this on in a polycentric way, I really think we can get somewhere. But to me, that is the number one promise of the greatest aspect of streets in LA, which is not the small little streets which we have here and there, but thinking of it in a very big way to tackle what I consider to be the most pressing issue facing Southern California today.
Thank you. I understand that Todd has our questions. I want.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and hi, Vinayak. What a gorgeous book. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm going to need to buy another bookshelf, I think. It's, and get another credit card. But thank you for sharing that. And I've got a macro question, and such a good discussion, prompted by the book, and then a micro question. I'm gonna ask the micro question because you show your case. One of your cases is, I'm a big fan of the Boulevard in Lancaster, and I love to show it to my students every year. And one reason I love it is because it's such a beautiful application of some beautiful ideas and what look like very in many cases implementable strategies to totally transform what's just an archetypal sprawl corridor. And it seems so successful and so applicable in so many places. So that's why I like it so much. It just seems like a really useful case on its own, but that can be, lessons can be taken in so many different places, especially in our region and in other American places. And something else that you mentioned had to do with, isn't it great when you can go back on projects that you've worked on and look at lessons learned. And so I would like to put those two together and ask you, if you've been back, I presume you have, is there anything you would do differently, seeing how the Boulevard was implemented in pieces, I presume, or maybe it wasn't, maybe it was all at once. Anything that you would change, anything that turned out especially well, or things that you wish you could adjust or toss and do something different?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Todd. So yes, I mean, I'll answer the second part first. The difficulty with COVID has been that there's been this huge disconnect for all of us to really continue studies that we were doing. So I will confess that I haven't been able to really capture the sort of ongoing legacy, partly because during the COVID years, particularly 3 years, there's really practically nothing going on, at least for any of us to really go and even document anything. So in that sense, it's probably a good idea to now take it back again and see how all that happened. So in that sense, I would say the answer is no. But in the bigger balance of your question of what things could be done differently, et cetera, I think the greatest success story of Lancaster from the city's perspective is that it was done in the economic downturn. That's a huge thing that a lot of people don't realize. 2010, if you remember what was going on, there was really nothing much that was happening. And the city had secured a federal grant. They put in some of their own money. And they brought in a crew. All the construction workers that did the Boulevard were from the city itself. And that was an amazing thing, which I write about in the book. So these are behind the scenes success stories where, you give employment to people through the construction of the Boulevard, instead of having a crew that was from outside. And all this speaks to kind of the leadership and the administration of the city and the sort of visionary way of thinking about a city that is a very hot city. It's in a desert. So in many ways, the idea of the Rambla, of whatever you want to call it, of planting 300 trees and then just planting the heck out of it, made a lot of sense because it is in a desert, in a hot desert. So all that made complete sense. But I want you to know, in terms of what could be done differently, there were a lot of challenges along the way. For instance, one of the biggest challenges was the downtown over time, because of sprawl, had been inundated with a lot of parking lots. There was just tons of parking. So a lot of the buildings, you see the 1- and 2-story buildings had tons of parking. They were eating up a lot of land in the downtown. And so the contradiction was, if the Boulevard became successful, obviously you're going to need more parking because more development is going to come. So the linchpin of the design really was that central pedestrian zone under the double row of trees became a parking lot of sorts. So it parks, enormous number of cars, angle parked on both sides for almost a mile, and then it flexes itself and takes it out when it wants to. What we had proposed during our initial designs was not to forget the side streets, which is extremely important in any project of this nature, that while you can take one street and make it something beautiful, the impact it has on the side streets often goes underestimated. But the budget constraints obviously didn't make that possible. So one of the things that didn't happen is, instead of thinking of it as a network of activity, which could have happened one block deep on each side, it now became just a face-to-face enhancement, right? That was one. The second thing that also didn't happen is something Pasadena has done so successfully, which is to energize its alleys. So every block in Lancaster had an alley. And it was part of our proposal to use many of Pasadena and other ideas. And again, it's there in our drawings, but hopefully over time, this will happen. And the third thing that, also answering your question in sort of what we could do differently, and also what didn't happen, is, I choose not to talk of Lancaster as design with a capital D. Because there are many streets with greater budgets and wonderful designs. I mean, every lamppost is beautifully designed, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the lesson Lancaster taught us, some of us, is maybe at the end of the day, design only goes so far, that you can have streets that are so beautifully designed and have other issues. And you can have a street that the design is pretty okay or not, but it just changes the optimism of the city. That's the best way I can put it. So I don't know if you know, but they actually have a sign on the freeway now as you're exiting called the Boulevard. So you exit the freeway and you go down and you got to find the Boulevard. So in terms of what we could have done differently, it is less of a question, Todd, than what simply couldn't happen along the way. Like any project, I could say the same thing for Del Mar Station or so many others, where you just don't get to 100% at all. And yet the project sparks a success story that is totally beyond anything you expected, or perhaps even you tried. Todd, you muted.
That's the exciting, surprising part of cities in general, but also these projects, is their chance to catalyze other changes that you might foresee, or you might hope for, or might be completely unforeseeable. So thank you for that great story, because I've always been a fan of that project, and now I know even more. Thank you.
Marcia, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say what a wonderful book this is, and your presentation is expanding my head. It's like this. But I've always thought that to reinvent our cities, we need to reinvent how we work together. And those of us who worked in bureaucracies, it is a struggle. The streets are basically the creatures of public works and transportation. They have a lot of money, a lot of power in city government, and it's hard to get on a level playing field to introduce new ideas. In old Pasadena 30 years ago, I put together a group and interdisciplinary and interdepartmental that worked together to do it, to come up with ideas, to bounce things off. And we were able to do old Pasadena because we did it that way. We didn't do it linear. We didn't do it. Jane Jacobs talks about it in her last chapter, where, bureaucracies have their own logic. Everybody has a work program and they do it, but it all comes down into a place. So have, a vertical thing. So it's getting those pieces to come down with a vision, with the passion, with the money. And that's a practical consideration, to how you work in cities. And there's always a huge pushback because department heads don't want to do it. They don't want to do that. And there's a basic misunderstanding of you know, what it is when you do that, because you involve community and you involve all kinds of people doing that. It's planning with a flat surface, you know. So all to ask is that wrestling power away from these huge departments that have a very, you know, mono lens. They see the world through their own perspective, and it's hard to get, quote, creative, introduce new ideas and do this. Complete Streets is certainly a good effort to do that. But you, looking at the cities you've looked at, do you have any thoughts on that? And, you know.
Yeah, Marsha, I do. So I just want to point out, and I've written this in other books, which is what is important to note is in other parts of the world, and particularly the global South, cities are not doing tactical, you know, insurgent, do-it-yourself urbanism because it's cool or because they love doing it. They do it because institutions are not performing. Yeah. They're doing it out of desperation. So it is not. So I'll say it the other way. I think the best way I can say it is we need sparks of creativity, like these insurgent efforts and these guerrilla urbanisms and all these tactics, and that's which I've captured in the book through so many authors who've done it. But I think at the end of the day, they are band-aids. They're band-aids in terms of a long-term aspiration that we need to hit. So this is what the book is really espousing to. The critique that this book is implicitly making, I think, is you hear a lot of mighty commentary from urban designers, planners about how things ought to be. Okay, I'll say that again. You know, we all talk about how streets ought to be. But getting there, as Marsha, you pointed out, is a whole different subject within the realities of our own cities. And you've struggled with it probably more than many of us here. So all these sort of insurgent efforts, tactical efforts, are first steps, probably more so in other parts of the world than here, to begin to create another alternative awareness of what streets can be. The advantage we have here, and I keep saying this as someone, you know, who spent half of his life in another part of the world, is there is enormous privilege to have the freedom to go to a city council session, stand up and speak your heart out and tell them, damn it, we got to stand for streets. I mean, that is a privilege that so many parts of the world simply do not have. So I think it's important to recognize that as wonderful as these efforts are, they need to be admired as counterpoints to planning that is not working. So all these wonderful events in Cairo and everything I talked about is because many of these cities don't have a choice, and other actors are stepping in to take care of things. I think for us, it's different because we already have a lot of years and thinking and resources. The question here, therefore, for me is, how do we now bring in some of these ideas that we love? The modernist regimes of urbanism have taken away a lot of the spontaneity that street life and public spaces had. I think we all know this. Now, how does top-down Euclidean planning begin to craft new tactics and rules to include those as part of a regulated geography? That's really the difficult question that all of us, I think, are trying to grapple with.
Well, and I would add that, you know, and how do you do it when the car, when there's huge vocal outcry that occurs when, you know, when change is proposed, that has amazing weight, you know, in council meetings. So you counter that.
I think Mick has a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vin. That was amazing. I'm just sitting here and trying to take it all in. I'm wondering where the friction point is between a plan that you feel is going to come to a place when it can be realized, and where is the friction point to actually realize the plan, and how is that negotiated or shepherded along?
Well, I mean, I'll answer the question broadly, Mick, and I hope I understood your question. You know, I'm only 25 years in the field. That's not much time. But from my years, from that limited experience, the only thing I've learned is, I think there is no substitute. The greatest virtue that any of us could do as designers, planners, or architects, or whoever we are, is flexibility. And I think we are learning the hard way, at least in our practice, we've learned the hard way that regulation can only take you so far. In fact, regulation can, obviously the virtues of regulation are extremely well known. There's no reason to talk about that. But regulation also has a way of making things enormously predictable, whether it is urban form, whether it is the look of a street, whether it is the life on the street, you know, the control of a street, where you walk, how it looks, that has its demerits. So I guess it's a nuanced subject, but where I'm going with this is, I think part of the future thought of planning, particularly in the US, is going to be, particularly in the mainstream planning regimes in the US, top-down planning, regulated planning, Euclidean planning, is going to be how to create regulations and policies that on the one hand predict only what is minimally essential and leave a lot of the things that we have, you know, sort of reacted to over the last 20 years. I mean, what has really happened, in my opinion, Mick, as I've observed it, is there came a moment where the anathema of sprawl really hit us in the face. And we said, oh my God, this is horrible. I got to react to it. And the reactions went so far that we now wanted to control everything about it. We absolutely want to control everything. We want to control how form looks, how buildings look, how, you know, how everything ought to look. I mean, and that's a difficult question because we are reacting. Anytime you react, it's fair. I mean, it's just, I mean, what we've created through legal policy in the United States over the last many years is in many ways sad. I mean, this is one of the greatest nations in the world, and the sprawl is legal. I always tell my students, you don't realize, but sprawl is legal. Every aspect of sprawl in the United States is done by law. So we've reacted to it. And as a result of the last 20 or 30 years, that reaction has taken it to an extreme. And so we now write rules and plans and regulations that want to predict absolutely everything. And where I'm going with this is, I think as this idea matures, as we all mature into what we are doing, it seems to me that I think we'll figure out a way, a frontier where it comes to a moment where you have to regulate only what is essential and, you know, lacks many of the things. That's why I was showing you case studies in Japan, etc. I mean, this is what hit me about these places. The pedestrian quality of many of these cities like Tokyo, etc., is impeccable. 10 times greater than anything we would want. Every building lines the street. Everything is impeccable. Everyone walks. Everyone has transit. But the look of the place, the architectural expression, the character is so complex and so evolving and so changing over time that it is a whole other subject that I think maybe is something we will get into. So I would say, in a short way, Mick, the more flexible we can be, the more tolerant we can be in terms of accommodating a lot of, embrace the idea that cities are complex, people are complex, tastes are complex. It's not about, you know, 5 or 6 power structures. It seems to me that's where we will eventually go over the next couple of decades. But not yet, but probably will over time.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this really terrific discussion this evening. Vinayak and Claire, thank you so much for sharing all your ideas and all the various case studies in your book, Vinayak. It's quite fascinating. I do think that I've always kind of developed a sort of an interesting new perspective about streets over the past couple of years, primarily because of COVID. And I used to commute all the time, and now I telework, so I rarely commute at all. So I have a greater relationship with the streets just around my home. So I've learned from that. And I have a greater interest in what happens on the streets, and you know, ensuring that they're safe, obviously, but also being places where, you know, you can meet friends and do things and whatnot. Now, I live in Santa Monica, and all the streets are lined with restaurants that have all the, you know, all the tables outside, people eating and stuff like that. So it's been really neat, a new way to think about streets. So Vinayak's discussion this evening was the 9th one that we've had as part of this conversation with the author series. It's going strong. We will have more when that date comes closer, when we have the next one scheduled. We'll certainly let everyone know about that, and we hope that everyone can join us. So I'd like to again thank Vinayak for chatting about his book, and Claire for moderating the discussion. And I'd also like to wish everybody a good rest of the evening, and we'll be back in touch the next time we have another conversation with the author. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Vinayak.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, Claire.